Folks, I'm going to get started. So thanks for joining me today. I'm going to talk about digital identity and schools. So my name's Dan Moore. I'm head of DevRel at a company called FusionAuth. We're a CIAM provider, but we have had a number of clients who have used us in school settings. So what we're going to talk about today, this is the infamous agenda slide that the content director wanted. We're talking about why you might care about digital identity in schools, applicable laws. We're going to cover a smattering of those. We're going to talk about some features that were surprising to me around identity in the school setting, and then some unique integrations that you want to be aware of. So let's talk about why you might care. Well, schools are big business. There's a lot of money flowing through there. According to an OECD support report in 2018, there was $1.5 trillion of budget flowing through schools. And obviously, you're not going to have access to all that. You talk to any teacher or professor, they're going to tell you that. But there's a lot of money flowing through there. And that number is just for Australia, the UK, and the US. And there's also a lot of professionals. According to that same report, there's over 1 million professionals involved in K through 12 in the US alone. So it's a big market. And if you look at that market and you think about it from an identity standpoint, it's kind of like a customer identity and access management system. It's, you squint a little bit. You need scale because you need to support those millions of teachers or professionals or kids. You have, even though there's a lot of money flowing through, because the way schools are funded, they're cost conscious, so you can't charge dollars per seat. It needs to be at a low price point. And because of that, you also need to have some self-service options. And then you have similar things with most identity systems like roles and permissions. But there are some significant differences. Kids are not your standard customers, right? Not standard users. They have different needs ranging based on their legal standing or their capabilities to actually, for instance, type in a username and password. Schools are not your standard organizations because they sometimes have a fair amount of autonomy, but they also have some dictates that are imposed from above, right, by districts or by laws. And something that's really important and that was eye-opening to me as I wrote this talk is that kids are not your only audience. Students are not your only audience when you're thinking about schools. Let's take a deeper dive to look into which audiences you might want to think about. The first is obviously the students, but then parents are a major set of stakeholders too, and they have their own needs. They need to be able to access kids' records, and also one of the things that I think schools are moving more and more towards is making functionality that used to require calling up a secretary at the school, pushing that all online. For instance, I was able to actually set up which bus route my kids, or sign up for a bus route for my kids, just using an online system. They also may need to access kids' records or access applications for kids on behalf of those children, whether that's setting something up or helping them out with a particular system. So there's an impersonation aspect that you want to be aware of for parents. Teachers are obviously a huge audience as well, a huge set of users. And the applications that you're building in the school system could range from apps that are helping teachers directly assist teaching kids, excuse me. So that would be an educational application that the teacher needs to know how to administer, or it could be an application that actually helps the teachers teach more effectively. There's an application I saw pitched once where apparently teachers need to, and this is aimed at elementary school kids, when they move from year to year, you actually have a meeting at the end of the school year to place kids into the correct classes. So if you're graduating from 4th grade, you're going to be pushed into 5th grade, but based on personalities or needs, you might, the teachers will get together and kind of try to put classes together. The other thing that is really interesting about teachers is that they need pretty intense access to a cohort of students for the year they're teaching them, and then after that, they should have very minimal access. Administrators obviously need access to, this is superintendents or principals. They need to be able to administer teachers and students. And then an audience that was kind of surprising to me was alumni. And so we have definitely had some clients who were thinking about their total users, and they were worried about alumni being this ever-growing cohort. And so that affected how they thought about their billing, how they thought about building their application to give this valuable set of users access to the application. Now again, not all these audiences are going to matter to everyone in this room, but they're all things that you want to consider. Finally, we're not just talking about kids that are under the age of consent, that the parents, essentially kids under a certain age, are legal extensions of the parents. High school and university kids actually become their own legal entities at certain ages, in different locations, in different ways. Finally, the additional complexity about the audience is that people can be members of more than one. People can straddle fences. We actually had a client who said, they had a real issue with our system because they weren't sure how to model teachers that were in different districts or teachers that were also parents. And so those are data modeling things that you're going to want to think about when you think about identity in a school context. Let's talk about some common legal requirements. So and by the way, there's a ton of legal requirements, and they definitely vary based on locality, so I'm not going to go into every single one, but I'm going to give you an overview of some important ones. So COPPA is the first one, and this stands for the Children Online Privacy and Protection Act. This applies to people that are selling into the USA or companies that are based in the US. There are some carve-outs for nonprofits. It was passed in 1998, but the Congress delegated the rulemaking to the FTC, and it's been revised a couple of times. The focus for COPPA is kids under 13 and what data they can give and what parental consent needs to happen in order for organizations or companies to use that data. So what are some examples of data that falls under COPPA for children? Well, it's obvious things like name, address, telephone number, but it also might be things that you don't necessarily think about, like a photo of a child is actually protected data that requires consent, or even something as innocuous as an online identifier like a username. So these are all things that if you're collecting this data, you need to get parental consent to do so if the child's under 13. What is valid parental consent? Well, the FTC has done a pretty good job of outlining some specific things or activities that you can take to get parental consent. It can range from things that are kind of old school, like actually comparing a government ID to the person who's offering the consent, or signing a permission slip, which, still, I've signed permission slips recently. So still around. The one that's probably most applicable in a digital identity standpoint is called Email Plus. And how this basically works is you send an email when someone offers consent to the parent's email address, and then you also send another email a period of time later. I think it's 48 to 72 hours later. And both of those emails contain information about the consent that was granted and how to revoke it. And so the idea is that if a kid has access to their parent's email account and they offer consent the first time, they won't necessarily have access later. So it gives the parent a fighting chance to read that consent. The FTC has a nice full list, so I'm not going to go into every single one of those, but they have pretty good frequently asked questions. So let's talk about Europe. So the GDPR-K is the kind of the analog of COPPA in Europe, and is part of the General Data Protection Regulation, and it applies to people in the European Union. It was passed in 2016, and the focus is on, again, kids under a certain age. I say 16 or possibly younger because member states actually can dictate what is the age of self-consent. It can be as low as 13, but no lower. And again, it's about data collection. And if you're collecting that data, how can you verifiably get parental consent? The difference is that it focuses on reasonable effort. What is reasonable? I don't know, but this is definitely not reasonable. Well, whatever reasonable is, this is the opposite. I wasn't able to find a ton of great guidance out there, but one piece of one government published manual basically said, hey, it needs to fit what the action is. So if the action is they're signing up for a newsletter, that's a public newsletter that basically is repurposing content, then you make them check a box that say I'm old enough. If it is getting access to like a private, unmoderated game forum where they're going to be exposed to who knows what, you might want to take further steps and do some of the things like what COPPA provides and actually try to really find the parent to get the consent. So this seems like a lot of work, right? Both these privacy things, these are both major markets. You're probably going to want to sell into one or the other. It can be kind of frustrating to think about how to get parental consent. But before you freak out about that, ask your lawyers, first of all. Don't rely on some random guy at Aniverse. But I did talk to the clients, a number of our clients, and they basically said, actually, parental consent is a non-starter for us. We don't have to worry about it at all. And there were two main reasons. The first was they sold to teachers or one of those other audiences, and they didn't collect kid information at all. And the second is, if they did collect PII around kids, they basically slid in underneath the school or the school district, basically the purchasing entity's privacy policy. So they said, we're covered by the school district, and they didn't have to do any of these things. So think about that when you're thinking about your identity problems. FERPA is the last law that I'm going to cover, and this is the Federal Education Records Privacy Act. I just looked this up 20 minutes ago. So, and it is really about giving children, students, access to their educational records and the right to correct them if they're incorrect. And this has a nice split at 18. Before 18, it's the parents that get the access, and after 18, it's the students that get the access. It applies to any student that takes federal funds. So that would be most K through 12 public schools, and then a lot of universities as well. So let's talk about some features that I found surprising when I started to talk to some of these clients that were deploying into schools. The first is, and again, not all this will apply to everybody, but pre-literate kids actually have an interesting problem, right? They can't type in a username and password. They still need accounts because you still want to track their progress if you're in an educational app. And so therefore, you need some kind of identifier. Otherwise, you're going to have that poor kindergarten teacher running around trying to log in 30 kids every day. The identifiers need to be cheap, durable, and low-tech, and something that you can actually hand to a kindergartner. And the solution that a couple companies came up with was you print a QR code that has authentication information in it, and then that QR code, owning that, is the factor of authentication. So it looks a little bit something like this. And multiple companies have offered this. I did not decode that. I don't know if I would take a picture of that because it was off of the clever.com website, but I'm pretty sure that they encoded account information into that QR code. And again, this works because the accounts are relatively low value. If someone steals a kindergartner's login information, I think they have bigger problems. But it was an interesting exercise in how do you solve this problem for this user that is not a typical kind of user, right? Most users that we interact with in the IM space are actually literate. Another thing that came up was password complexity rules. And so we're a CIM system. We have password complexity rules built into our application. Sorry, NIST, we do. But I talked to a client, and they basically said, well, we had to re-implement password complexity rules. And the reason why points to something that I think is really interesting. The reason why is because the password complexity rules for a 5-year-old or a 7-year-old are different than for a 17-year-old or an 18-year-old. And so our system wasn't flexible enough to account for the age as an attribute of password complexity compliance. And so they had to re-implement their own thing, which points to the heterogeneity of a lot of the users that you're going to be dealing with if you're selling into schools, because students have a different legal and intellectual capacity as they grow in age. Another thing that was interesting to me was how fundamentally geography matters. And we all know that you need to, there are definitely countries out there or regions that require, thank you, PII to be in certain areas, but I talked to Hero Technologies, one of our clients, and they said that they could not use anything outside of New Zealand. They were based in New Zealand, and so there was all kinds of cloud providers they couldn't use at the time because the data had to be resident inside New Zealand if it was PII for kids. Let's talk about some unique integrations. You're probably going to be integrating with an existing identity provider. Most kids get issued some kind of username and password, and it's stored someplace else. So if you are working in that landscape, you're going to be integrating with an existing system. These are two common ones. One thing that was interesting to me is that they actually are administered at different levels. So in Australia, they're administered at the state level. And then in New Zealand and the USA, it's the district or possibly the school level. And so that means that, on the one hand, you're going to be thinking about a lot more integrations based on the locality, conceivably a lot more integrations based on the locality you're in. But if you're integrating with, in the US, you probably have a little more ability to actually get on the phone with the administrator than you would in Australia. LTI is another standard out there, and basically this is a platform that you can snap into. It stands for Learning Tools Interoperability. It's a standard that's been around for a number of years. The most recent version was released in 2021. And basically, if an LMS is LTI compatible and you build a system that's LTI compatible, you can snap your application in. It's built on authorization and authentication standards we all know and love, like OIDC and JOTS. And examples of applications that might snap into LTI would be basically like if you write a calculus teaching engine, you can plug that in, and like any other platform, it's going to give you expanded reach. LTI does have the idea of users and the idea of provisioning. I haven't done an implementation of LTI, but one of our clients did, and they said it wasn't too painful to sync up their CIAM system, which is us, with LTI. Clever is another one out there that's similar to LTI. It offers identity management and an app platform. I kind of think of it like the AWS marketplace for EdTech, and it's more of a de facto standard. And then the final standard that I think is worth knowing something about is the Systems Interoperability Framework. This is a data sharing standard, and this was brought to my attention by one of our clients who basically said that data is a mess in education, and they were hoping that this standard, which originated in Australia, but actually has been rolled out across all 50 states in one form or another, according to their website, would actually help with some of those problems. So, to sum up, when you're building for schools and you're thinking about identity in schools, you have a lot of attributes that are similar with a typical CIAM solution. Scale, need for self-service, the cost structure. But you also have some fundamental differences. You need to think about additional legal concerns, whether that's data governance or like data locality, the laws that I went through. And by the way, if you're in a different country, please check out the laws in that country, because every country seems to have their own set of laws around PII, and kids are a commonly protected audience. And then you might have feature issues too. And so that would be things like the integrations I talked about, whether you want to support Clever or LTI. And then the final thing I want to kind of end on is the interesting features that I experienced. And I think the heterogeneity of students is something that really is, it was something that was eye-opening to me. If I go buy something from Target right now, and then in 2 years go buy something from Target again, although let's be honest, there'll probably be more there'll be a shorter duration between those periods of purchases. I'm essentially the same person in those 2 years, but kids change so much. Between a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old, there's a lot of capability differences, and between a 17-year-old and 19-year-old, there's educational and legal differences, so you need to account for those in your applications. And that is all I have. I'm happy to take a couple questions. Or you can get 5 minutes of your life back.
So I exclusively work with higher ed space, more than K through 12, and one of the things that often trip up vendors is their extraordinarily heavily and complex reliance on SAML. Do you see the same in the K through 12 space?
I haven't. A lot of OpenID Connect, actually, is what I said. And then there's some kind of custom integrations. But I went to your talk earlier, and I heard you say that. And the clients that I asked about, none of them have mentioned SAML. They all said OIDC is the thing. Like I said in the slide, Google and Microsoft Azure were the two big ones. Two big identity providers. Yes?
For the under 18 crowd, what role do you see parents playing or guardians playing in account creation and then ability to access, like say, the child's accounts on an ongoing basis?
Sure, so the question is, for the under 18 crowd, are parents primarily responsible or are kids responsible? Sure.
And then do you see a role, or the folks you work with, do you see a role where parents are also given the ability to audit whatever the child is doing?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we've definitely seen that kind of from the grades perspective, or things that are like more kind of firmly out there that actually the schools are creating. But as far as the actual applications, I don't see a lot of that, right? I'm speaking a little bit from personal experience, but my kids definitely had a number of accounts that they've just kind of created right at the school, and I didn't have any real access into what they were doing. I guess I trust the teachers. I haven't talked to our clients about that particular aspect. So, oh yeah, please.
Commercial entities are no longer allowed. They've never been allowed, but they're going to really start pushing on the fact that it has to be the parent or guardian providing the parental consent to the commercial provider who has to comply.
So I have a question for you then. Like, are they saying that the FTC is saying, hey, schools, you can buy this thing and you can use it within the school, but as soon as it goes outside of the school,
If they have a contract, if they can demonstrate control of the data, then they can stand in the place of the parent
Sure.
and provide the consent. But if it is a commercial app or service who's commingling that data, allowing it to have onward use, then they have to comply with COPPA. So it's not that the school has to be
Right.
compliant, it's that the app or the service has to be.
Interesting.
So, I operate a consent service that helps in that area. So
Awesome.
and we're safe harbor under COPPA, and so that's where I'm getting my information.
Great, great, cool. All right, any other questions last minute? Yes?
I'm from a different jurisdiction in New Zealand. Just a quick question in terms of the right duty of the student. What do you guys do, or is any consideration being given to once an individual departs from the school system or goes on to higher education, how are they getting access to their uni record? Do they carry their credentials with them and have general access, or is that something else that hasn't been thought of?
Yeah, I don't have direct experience with that. Sure, sure. So the question was when, oops, I should have been doing that before. So the question was when someone graduates from a school, how do you deal with them getting access or continue to have access to the records that, or the data they created in the school? Is that a fair assessment? Sure. I don't know. Does anyone know? Oh, sorry. The question is, you move to higher education. How do you have access to the data, or do your credentials kind of carry along with you? And as far as I can tell, at least in my school district, which again, I'm not going to lean on clients because I haven't asked them about that, but in my school district, it just goes away. You don't really have access to your credentials anymore. They're assigned at the district by district basis, at least in my school district. Does anyone else have any insight on that?
You have to delete or obfuscate after a period of time so that you don't keep this record.
Because they're out of that system, so they don't have access to that anymore?
After a period of time, you just like it has to be deleted or not.
Is that a FERPA thing?
I can't remember because I've thought about it for a little while.
Okay, cool, great. Well then, thank you all. I really appreciate it. I have to get off the stage, so.